As Lefty drifted back into Ashtab, he found himself hoping that he wouldn't encounter anyone. His family and his neighbors would undoubtedly have many questions about his whereabouts, and he was completely unprepared to answer any of them. He wished that he could simply return home quietly, without the hassle of having to explain himself. Fortunately for him, that's exactly what happened. Walking into the center of town, he found it uncharacteristically barren, the wind whistling across the abandoned streets in a way that would have worried him on any other day, but today it had the opposite effect. The town was completely empty, and Lefty couldn't have been more happy about it. With a smile on his face, he headed home, walking casually towards his humble 2-room house, which he was glad to find just as he had left it. In one door and then another, he passed quickly into his bedroom, eager to just relax, to feel the familiar sensation of straw on his back. With a little jump, he plopped satisfyingly into bed, marveling at just how good it was to be back home, his simple straw mattress feeling so much more comfortable than usual. He lay back, staring up at the coarse adobe ceiling above him, his hands behind his head as he enjoyed the relaxing solitude. All was well, and he was at peace with the world. And then, Lefty woke up. At first, he was even more confused than you are now. Not only because the location he woke up in was far more foreign to him than the familiar setting of his dream, but because, up until this point, he had never actually had a dream before. At least, not one that he could remember. The disoriented young man studied his surroundings for quite some time, mouth agape as he tried to remember exactly where he was and what events had brought him here. He stared blankly at Old Blue sleeping soundly nearby, and then at the ornate stone walls of the food tabernacle surrounding him, recognizing neither at first, but slowly remembering them as the details of his dream began to fade, and the details of reality came to claim their rightful place in the forefront of his mind. It had been almost 12 hours since Lefty had opened up the box and freed the creature trapped inside, and he had learned quite a lot since then. For one thing, he had learned that the voice inside the box belonged to a Kickin by the name of Old Blue. Now, if you've never seen a Kickin before, well, I don't blame you. They're unfortunately quite rare these days, and the few that are still around tend to be hidden away or imprisoned in cages, just like poor Old Blue. It's a shame, really. But I digress. If I had to describe a Kickin to someone who'd never seen one before, I'd say to imagine a creature with the head of an adorable kitten and the body of a Zork. That is to say, they have no body. Zorks, of course, don't exist. Anyway, jutting from the place where you might expect a neck or a body to be, Kickins instead have 2 stout webbed feet, which are orange in color, and similar to what you'd see on a duck, or any other kind of waterfowl for that matter. In addition, on either side of their face, underneath their pert triangular ears, they have a set of small feathered wings, which enable them to fly in much the same way that a chicken does. Poorly, and for a limited time only. On a physical level, Kickins are as worthless as they are helpless, possessing neither strength nor speed, nor even those handy opposable thumbs that most other sentient races seem to have. No, on their own, Kickins can scarcely fend for themselves, which is why they've traditionally relied on the other, more capable races of At to care for them. As for why anyone would want to care for a Kickin, well, what they lack physically, they more than make up for mentally. Most notably, Kickins possess an absolutely flawless memory. Once a Kickin sees or hears something, it will never forget it for as long as it lives. This is especially impressive given that Kickins can easily live for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Their long lifespan and perfect memory, combined with their natural affinity for the spoken word, made Kickins very valuable to certain people. Long ago, they were actually status symbols of those with wealth and power, Rich families would keep kickens around for generations, using them as flawless record keepers, unparalleled storytellers, and invaluable personal assistants. In addition to their outright usefulness, kickens also have the advantage of being quite adorable. After all, they possess the combined cuteness of both cats and birds, along with a friendly attitude, making their companionship as pleasant as it was useful. All in all, it's easy to see why so many found kickens worth feeding and protecting, and why it's such a tragedy that so many of them were killed. But I suppose that is a story for another time. As for Old Blue himself, he was a particularly handsome little kicken, though you'd scarcely be able to tell if you saw him flutter out of his boxy prison that night. After being trapped in there for days without proper hygiene, he was an absolute mess. His normally pristine golden-brown fur was a much darker shade of dirt-brown, coated in sand and dust, and sticking up in random messy clumps. His reddish-orange feathers, usually so straight and stylish, were severely ruffled, making flight even more difficult than usual, and completely messing up the beard-like style of his facial feathers. Worst of all, his bright red eye patch, the most distinguishing thing about him and the only article of clothing that he wore, was stained and misaligned, nearly exposing the disfigured area where his right eye used to be. I'll spare you the finer details of Lefty and Blue's initial meeting. Though this encounter would eventually prove to be one of the most significant moments in the history of AT, it consisted mostly of awkward pauses, sprinkled in with stiff dialogue asking basic questions. You see, the dazed kicken had been held captive in that box for almost a week by that point, trapped in near total darkness which had only been broken for brief moments when his captors chose to feed him. As you might imagine, this made his sudden freedom quite disorienting, and as a result, his explanation of kickens to the ignorant Lefty was much less coherent than the one you just received. Old Blue's speech was littered with pauses and stammering as the flustered creature attempted to explain what he was, while stumbling around in a daze, shaking the dust and dirt from his wings, and trying to adjust to the sudden brightness of the nearby bonfire. It was only after Lefty's hunger returned, and the two of them realized they had a mutual desire for food, that the pair actually began to converse normally, deciding that they should work together in order to acquire some sustenance, as well as put some distance between themselves and the men Lefty had just fought, lest they wake up and decide to seek revenge. Fortunately for Lefty, Old Blue knew where they could sate their hunger and hide from the men at the same time. And fortunately for Old Blue, Lefty was willing to carry him. So, at Old Blue's command, Lefty lifted the dirty, disoriented little creature up to his shoulder, and with their simple, symbiotic relationship clearly established, the two embarked on their adventure. It was about this time that Lefty learned the men he had knocked out were amateur chefs, and that their location was not merely some random camping spot. Nearby, set directly on the other side of the bonfire, and built right into the face of the towering cliff, stood an ornate metallic door, which was one of the many entrances to the food tabernacle. Now, I'm going to assume that, much like Lefty, much like most people these days, you know next to nothing about food magic, and even less about the 10 great tabernacles of Scaevolas. I'm also going to assume that, again, like Lefty, you're much more interested in pressing onwards than getting extended lessons in cooking or history. So, rather than give even more lengthy exposition so soon after the last bout, I'm simply going to continue onwards, pressing forward blindly, just like Lefty did, ignorantly entering the tabernacle without any idea of what might lay inside, save for the promise of food and shelter. Upon opening the door, Lefty was met with a sight which made him pause in amazement. Before his eyes lay a magnificent cyclopean hallway, with a vaulted ceiling so high that he could scarcely see it from the ground. The grand hallway stretched on for hundreds of hands, before opening up into an even larger multi-story room, the main hall of the Food Tabernacle. Truly it was a marvel of both engineering and craftsmanship, a gargantuan structure of artisan elegance with more than a dozen floors, which had been carved directly into the solid stone of the mountain itself. For the poor sand miner, who had only ever seen the simple adobe buildings of his hometown, the sight was simply breathtaking. He could not have imagined in his wildest dreams that such a place existed. In stark contrast to the majesty of the Food Tabernacle's construction was its complete and utter state of disrepair. Works of graffiti, both small and large, vulgar and artistic, covered its finely crafted stone walls. Dirt and garbage from every source imaginable littered the floor, providing food for hairy vermin which now infested the long-abandoned structure. As Lefty's footsteps echoed down the trash-covered hallways, they scattered in every direction. Large bears, some nearly the size of a human head, scurried off into the depths of the tabernacle for safety. Lefty marveled at the extreme juxtaposition. The walls themselves were nearly perfect, seemingly untouched by the many years which had obviously passed since their construction, lacking in any sign of natural wear and tear, and marred only by the hands of the unappreciative people who had passed through since. This is the point where most people would have stopped and started asking Old Blue a lot of serious questions about history and cooking. Lefty might have done this too, if not for the fact that his mind was suddenly overtaken by an indeterminate but strangely delicious smell, which came wafting at him from down the immense hallway. All his pondering about the nature of the tabernacle and its clearly rich history were soon drowned out by the impatient growls of his stomach, and the urging of his nose to find the source of the appetizing scent. And so, he and Old Blue simply ignored the defaced walls and piles of garbage, and instead traveled briskly past them. The two of them followed the delectable smell into a small room with a much lower ceiling, which sat embedded into the wall near the end of the hallway. Inside the room, they found a disorganized but relatively new encampment. Adventuring necessities like bedrolls, rucksacks, and lanterns were scattered around haphazardly, as were an inordinate amount of cooking supplies. Their eyes traveled across the room, looking among the mess for the source of the delicious smell, until finally they settled on a small makeshift oven which sat in the far end of the room. The dying embers of a once larger fire were still smoldering in that little pit, and above it a metal cooking pan, which held the source of the incredible scent, 2 freshly baked loaves of bread. Old Blue explained to Lefty that the camp had belonged to his captors, those freshly beaten chefs outside who had treated him so badly. With very little discussion on the matter, the two unanimously agreed that those men were indeed grumpsters of the highest caliber, and with no remorse whatsoever, Lefty promptly stole everything he wanted from their camp, stuffing as much as he could into one of their rucksacks before placing it onto his back. Then, using a pair of nearby oven mitts, he grabbed the entire tray of bread and left the room. While it may have been tempting for the hungry duo to simply sit and eat right there, the wise Old Blue reminded Lefty that the chefs might return at any moment, and that it would be much safer to put some distance between themselves and their enemies. And so, Lefty delved deep into the tabernacle, Old Blue jumping up to sit upon his head like some kind of exotic hat, as he guided his new companion farther and farther into the structure. The two of them wandered around for nearly 30 moments, weaving through the maze-like structure, going up staircase after staircase, traveling down long forked hallways, until the sweeping vista of the main chamber had long since disappeared behind them. Finally, they found themselves in a small but cozy chamber, not unlike the one they'd stolen from below, but sitting more than 10 floors higher than where they started. Catching his breath, Lefty leaned against the cool stone wall, taking off his newly acquired rucksack and dropping it to the floor, before plopping down himself to join it. Satisfied with the remoteness of their camp, the starving duo finally decided to sate their hunger. As Old Blue fluttered down off of Lefty's head, Lefty placed the bread pan down on the ground next to him, and removed one of the 2 loaves. With a quick twist, he split the loaf in half, taking one portion for himself, while extending the other half towards Old Blue, who looked up at his new companion with a perplexed look on his feline face. For half a moment, Old Blue simply looked between Lefty and the rather large portion he was being offered, the Kickin unsure if he should be touched by Lefty's generosity or amazed by his stupidity. Not only did Blue not have any hands with which to take the bread, but the half-loaf being given to him was clearly too much for such a little creature to eat. Before he could say anything, though, Lefty took a bite out of his own half, and promptly dropped Old Blue's portion to the dusty ground, his eyes going wide as his tongue was met with the single best thing he had ever tasted. As the thin outer crust gave way with a satisfying crisp, and the warm starchy goodness filled his mouth, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Without hyperbole, it was like biting into a miracle. The fluffy white dough of the bread seemed to expand in his mouth, while also melting like creamy butter. The incredible food simultaneously filled his empty belly, while feeling so light and fluffy that it required no effort to chew. A moment later, he swallowed his first bite, and the warm sensation of pure deliciousness on his tongue expanded to fill his entire body. His tired leg muscles, strained and sore after so much walking, lost their ache almost instantly, the feeling replaced by a soothing warmth and the strange sensation of jealousy. Lefty's legs actually lamented that they were not part of his digestive tract, and would therefore be unable to experience the amazing bread directly. Lefty slowly looked over at Old Blue as the world came back into focus, his jaw hanging open in slacked amazement, unable to articulate just how mind-blowingly awesome the bread was.
"Food magic,"
said the Kickin with a slight chuckle, as if reading his thoughts.
"I take it you've never had bread made by an actual chef before."
Lefty simply shook his head no, before taking another slow bite from the loaf in his hand.
"You should try something from an actual food meister. Makes this amateur stuff taste like stale dirt by comparison."
10 moments later, having barely finished off their first loaf of bread, the 2 new companions sat in a post-meal stupor, experiencing the kind of dull pleasure that one only gets after a thoroughly satisfying meal. With both their bellies full, and the sun outside having long since set, the pair decided to get some sleep. Lefty unfurled his stolen bedroll onto the cold stone floor, while Old Blue made a small makeshift nest out of a spare shirt which they had grabbed from the chef's camp. Lefty still had many questions, of course, but Old Blue was eager to sleep in comfort after so many days in the box. He told his new friend to save his questions for now, that he would tell him all about food magic and the history of the Tabernacle when they awoke in the morning. As Lefty finally remembered all this, his eyes lit up with excitement. It was probably morning now.